introduce the panel, the panelists, and Platypus, I have to give special thanks to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, who has helped say something about the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation.
Right, hi folks. I keep it short because it's quite technical, but I thought it would be interesting for all of you to know who we are, because Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is a bit of a strange beast, I think, for many, especially in the UK. It's quite not well known, basically. Some of you might know the Ebert Stiftung, or the Ebert Foundation, or the Adenauer Foundation. So these are all political foundations that are close to German political parties that are represented in the German Parliament. So the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, as you won't be surprised to hear, is affiliated with the German Left Party, Die Linke. That doesn't mean that we all are party members, far from it, but we work very closely with the German Left Party, with the NGL fraction in the European Parliament, and with the European Left Party. We are a political education organisation, and some of our work is more appropriately think tank work. We work through projects, conferences, workshops, and we connect people, we connect movements, and we publish publications, as it were. We work on a range of topics: climate change, climate justice, energy, poverty, migration, housing, commons, feminism, and a range of other topics. We have our headquarters in Berlin and about 20 offices around the globe. I represent the Brussels office, so it's the Brussels office that's funding this conference, or co-sponsoring the conference, and this is because we have started as of last year to work more closely and more systematically in the UK as well as in Ireland and the Scandinavian countries. I'm the responsible project manager for our regional work in this part of Europe. What we want to do is we want to get a better picture, better understanding of the left in the UK, the broad left in the UK, important leftist progressive actors, starting from grassroots level, community organisations up to party politics, trade unions, NGOs and so on. So I'm sure many of you are involved in organisations other than the Platypus Society. If you think you're working on issues that are related to the work we're doing in the Brussels office, if you're interested in collaborating with us, just come and chat to me after this panel or later today, or just drop me an email. I would be pleased to get in touch and to discuss things further. Right, so the UK strategy is one reason why we're here. We're also beginning to develop our work on feminists this year in Brussels office. We haven't put much emphasis on that beforehand. So the idea to have a feminism, Marxism panel at this conference is also because of that. And yeah, we would be keen to connect further with any of you who are interested. So thanks very much. One more note, because we are a government-funded organisation, we need to give a lot of evidence for everything we spend, for all the money we spend. Those of you who were here yesterday already signed in for yesterday, I think, on our participants list. I'd like to ask you to sign these again for today, for those of you who haven't signed in for all 3 days, and those of you who haven't been here, please just put your name on the list. That would help us enormously. Thanks very much.
So Platypus Affiliated Society, we organize reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old, new, and post-political left. For the possibilities of emancipatory politics today, we ask what the left has been and what it can yet become. Through our public fora and journalism, we bring together various tendencies, groups, and individuals to host the absent but necessary conversations about the death of the left, to consider its possible reconstitution today. At Goldsmiths, we host weekly coffee breaks on Mondays from 5 to 6 p.m. at 35 Cafe, and a weekly reading group on Sundays from 1 to 4 p.m. In this building, room 257. So please feel free to take copies of our free open submission journal, the Platypus Review. Oh, I don't see any copies up there. Oh, they're on that table. They're on that table. Which you can find, at the end of the panel. So this weekend we are hosting our 4th European Conference, and you can pick up the full schedule on the table near the door. And it's also kind of faded, but it's projected up here. And so after this panel, the next event is at 6 p.m. in the same room, and it is our closing plenary. What is the future of socialism? And then we'll also be having a teach-in with Boris Kagarlitsky tomorrow, and the time has been changed. So on the leaflets over there, it would say 1 p.m. It's actually at 2 p.m. And I believe it is in this room, but I'll check the pamphlets. And then finally, we have a chapter at LSE, London School of Economics, where we host a weekly reading group on Tuesdays from 6 to 9 p.m. and a weekly coffee break on Wednesdays from 6 to 7 p.m. And so now I would like to welcome you to our panel discussing Marxism and Feminism. Feminism and the woman's question has continually played an important role in the history of the left. This workshop seeks to bring together feminists of different generations to discuss the changing meaning of the relationship between feminism and socialism, in order to begin to talk about what the struggle for women's liberation might mean politically in the future. And so we have 3 panelists today discussing that with us, and so I'm going to introduce them from right, so my side to left. And so first we have, right here on my right, Roxanne Baker, who is a supporter of the International Bolshevik Tendency, a revolutionary Trotskyist organization. She has been active in revolutionary politics in Britain for the past 15 years. And she came around the left as part of the anti-war movement during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. As well as propaganda and recruitment work, she has been involved in the IBT's various United Front projects over the years, including current ongoing work in the anti-fascist movement. And to her left, we have Judith Shapiro, a 1966 LSE PhD in economics, returned in 2005 to the department's undergraduate tutor after an odyssey including 2 decades as revolutionary Marxist, leader of the Spartacist League, and an advisor to the Russian Ministry of Finance. And then finally, we have Sarah MacDonald from the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain, and she has graciously agreed to step in to be on this panel not merely an hour ago after we had some last-minute cancellations. So big thanks to Sarah for that. And so then, quickly before we begin, I'd like to read some of the questions that we gave to the panelists beforehand to respond to. What is feminism? What is the struggle for women's emancipation? How should we interpret the greater separation of mainstream feminism from socialist politics and from Marxist politics over the 20th century? What is the relationship between the fight for women's freedom and the project of human emancipation? And finally, what do the seeming advancements and successes of feminism in recent decades tell us when considered in relation to the failure of the proletarian struggle? So without further ado, our panelists will speak, and we ask that they keep their opening remarks to about 12 minutes, after which they will each have 5 minutes to respond to each other, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience. And Roxanne, if you want to start.
Thank you. By the way, I don't think I got that 3rd question, but hopefully it will all be built in together. They're all related. But just on the first bit, I would kind of question the premise of the question to a certain extent, because I think there's always been a separation between feminism and Marxism, and I don't think the fault lines really change as much as each new generation of activists tends to assume. I think the form differs, but the same fundamental patterns reassert themselves because we're still operating within class society, and more specifically within capitalist society. So 100 years after the 1918 Representation of the People Act, it's worth examining the courageous, groundbreaking feminism of Emmeline Pankhurst, which was also separatist and elitist. And it's worth comparing that to the activity of her communist daughter Sylvia, who focused more on working class women in the East End. And the distance between these 2 counterposed approaches has varied during the last century, but the fundamental ideological divergence remain. We think that the fight for women's emancipation is inextricably tied up with the fight for human emancipation. That is, the struggle to end class society and all the forms of social oppression that it generates. And concrete struggles to address particular aspects of women's oppression today must be taken up, but the victories won can only be partial and transitory as long as capital rules. And the material basis for completely uprooting the cause of women's suffering requires a revolutionary social transformation, which I would argue can only be accomplished by the creation of a mass revolutionary party based on a Marxist programme, composed of revolutionary women and men together in the same organisation, committed to fight for the interests of all the exploited and oppressed. But I think it's important early on to try to clarify what the real, as opposed to imagined, differences are between Marxists and feminists. Because many feminists believe that socialists tend to see women's rights as something that we could just wait until the after-revolution to solve. But I think that the genuine revolutionary left has always considered the fight for women's freedom as fundamental to the struggle for a socialist future. The struggle against the special oppression of women and other oppressed groups, racial, ethnic, sexual minorities, will be crucial to assembling social forces necessary to effectively challenge the control of a powerfully entrenched ruling class, which is inconceivable without the active participation of half the population, obviously. But the converse is also true. To try to end women's oppression without a class perspective, without a perspective of overturning capitalist tyranny, is not only counterproductive, but in the end is always shown to be to result in the betrayal of those who most need to be unshackled, the poorest and most oppressed women around the world. And feminism, even in its socialist feminist manifestation, tends to prioritise female emancipation over all other questions, or at least to approach the problem of class divisions alongside gender divisions, to equate class oppression with patriarchy, and the advocates of intersectionality, for example, do this as well with so-called classism, which they put on a par with other isms. And this then tends to lead feminists always to put an emphasis on the autonomy of women's organisations. And our organisation, which identifies with the tradition of the Russian Revolution, advocates the creation of a mass communist women's movement and organisations of other oppressed layers as transitional organisations, focused on the revolutionary mobilisation of women by actively addressing their particular concerns. And to be effective, such organisations must, of course, exercise considerable autonomy in the sense of being able to decide how to allocate their forces, what priorities to pursue at a particular moment. But they exercise this autonomy as part of a division of labour and in coordination with other elements of a common revolutionary movement through a revolutionary party, and that is partly how they derive their power and education as well. So Marxists take women's rights seriously now, not just in a future communist society, and IBT comrades of the International Bolshevik Tendency, of which I'm a member, male and female, in Britain, Ireland, all around the world, to New Zealand. We've got a record of active participation in united fronts around specific issues, including, for example, the defence of abortion rights, and issues such as reproductive rights, childcare, healthcare, and housing. We know these disproportionately affect women, but struggles around them are obviously crucial to the interests of the whole working class. I want to talk a little bit about the current manifestation of the Me Too campaign, because it's very topical and I think sums up some of the differences. As everyone I'm sure is aware, it began with accusations against the Hollywood heavyweight Harvey Weinstein, who seems pretty clearly to have been a serial abuser. And I think this whole issue is a good example of where Marxists and feminists both overlap and diverge. The unwanted sexual advances, sexual comments, judgment on our morality, sexual attractiveness, etc., that all women experience have a cumulative effect, and they comprise a large component of our oppression under capitalism. And the Me Too campaign on social media has exposed how widespread this is, how normal and how ingrained in our culture. Obviously, this needs to change. Where Marxists diverge from feminists is on how this can be done. The deep structure of the social relations that condition all aspects of life in this society, including relations between men and women, can't be fixed on an individual level, nor by any process that pits women against men. Sexual harassment, sexual assault, and inequalities between individual men and women reflect the economic and social oppression generated by the profound inequality of power, status, and economic resources. And women are at greater risk when other inequalities are present. Individual behaviour can be modified and social pressure can be brought to bear, and it has been brought to bear, to reduce the incidence of these abuses. But the root of the problem can't be addressed simply by re-educating men, but only through undoing the power disparities that come with capitalism. Now, the Me Too campaign, which aims to empower women, focuses on the sexual indignities and criminal assaults that we've suffered. But this can, of course, also play easily into the hands of those who want to deny us sexual agency and who would present sexual activity in and of itself sometimes as a danger to women. Marxists, and I think most feminists, reject this, and instead we want to fight for a society where everyone is free to express their own sexuality, free of any sort of legal or economic compulsion, on a fully informed, consensual basis. But I think it's important to distinguish sufficiently between a vast spectrum of incidents, ranging from rape and unwanted comments on the street. Neither is acceptable, but these are actions that are of very different magnitudes, which deserve very different responses and consequences for the perpetrator. The bourgeois justice system is notoriously bad at dealing with rape. But to respond to this by asserting that all accusations should be believed and made public fosters a climate of trial by media that won't guarantee justice for the victims and can end up destroying the lives and careers of the innocent. And disregarding the principles of due process and the presumption of innocence creates dangerous precedents for working women and men, particularly for those who dare to challenge the ruling class, like many people in this room. For example, employers otherwise uninterested in the well-being of their female employees might be very happy to use unsubstantiated charges against trade union militants, for example, as a pretext for firing. And similar sorts of accusations have historically been used to target leftists and others considered dangerous or inconvenient. In the US, lynchings of black men were traditionally motivated by claims that they'd somehow encroach on the sexual purity of white women. Men who assault or rape women should, of course, suffer severe consequences, but the limited safeguards that we've won in the past to protect the innocent against arbitrary and capricious persecution by the state or employers should be vigorously protected. It's also noticeable that the mainstream media only began to take serious notice of sexual harassment in the workplace when it involved high-profile Hollywood celebrities and the like. The constant, unrelenting sexual harassment of low-paid women in the service industries, for example, is of no great interest, presumably because it's not glamorous. But in fact, as we all know, women are at greater risk of sexual harassment and assault when other inequalities are present, as I've said before. So this is why we have to link it to the social basis. Successful bourgeois politicians such as Hillary Clinton, Theresa May, Angela Merkel, they've shown how ultimately irrelevant gender is, because under their watch nothing much changes for ordinary working women, apart from getting worse. They talk about women's equality, but their actions are determined by serving and protecting the status quo. And any attempt to build female unity across class lines, as feminists tend to do, can only amount to subordinating the interests of poor black and working class women to those of the rich ruling class women who derive substantial benefit from the existing social order, despite whatever prejudices that they also endure as women. The Marxist strategy of uniting all those exploited and oppressed by capitalism is the only way to lay the basis for a world free of social inequality and material want, and thus the possibility for each woman or man to pursue their own path and enjoy fulfilling personal lives. The pathology of sexual violence, which I've touched on in more detail, is at bottom a social problem which derives from a society which celebrates and rewards selfishness, possessiveness, the ability to wield power over others. And the only way that full human potential for love and all other areas of our lives can be realised is through the creation of a rationally planned socialist economy that can provide secure access to the essentials of existence for all. And once the material basis for social egalitarianism is achieved, the daily brutalities experienced by women at every social level, but particularly by those on the lower rungs of the social ladder, will gradually become a thing of the past. And until then, the best we can do is to struggle against the inequities, both great and small, imposed by capitalism, while actively seeking to construct a viable revolutionary movement capable of ending the horrors of class society once and for all.
I was sort of raised in the same tradition of seeing feminism and Marxism as distinct, exactly as the first speaker. And it isn't even from the Spartacist League that I got that. I joined it because it accorded with my attitudes towards the intersection of my interest in women's liberation and in class struggle. So I share that, but I cannot share, and I think it's important that I stress this, the view that it is just because it will take socialist emancipation to have women's emancipation, and I don't like the word emancipation, by the way. Notice the root there. I like liberation better, but it's okay. On that, it's unbelievable how much has been accomplished within the framework of bourgeois movements. And those of you who are not my age cannot imagine it. I grew up in the 1950s, and because my parents, like a lot of parents in the New Left in the United States, where I was a red diaper baby, so-called, and because of that, I knew exactly how bad it was. And it wasn't just bad for women, everything was repressed. It included small things in this repression and regimentation. So I'll point to things that always fascinate me, like why did we have to take years to invent a suitcase on wheels, right? Because it wasn't done to have suitcases on wheels. So we invented the wheelbarrow about 30 years ago. And the same thing is true about rucksacks. I was the first person to wear it. I used to embarrass my students at Goldsmiths until they went and found out that it was trendy. Because I didn't want to carry my books like this anymore. And so that was part of society and the absence of liberation as a whole that I think was true for, as I look at people coming from different countries here, was true everywhere. I used to try to explain to my students that hemlines were a certain length and then you had to change them. You know, and this was in and that was out and this was the color. We've seen this disappear. And it happened partly through the process of getting richer and education, but partly, and it's the thing I'm proudest of, the one thing that when I look back on my life I think was not in vain was that I was a visible molecular part of the founding of the women's liberation movement in the United States. I was very excited. I have the Prezi to show off. There's somebody in Leeds is doing a PhD on the history of the American women's movement, and she has a map. And there I am in the upper left-hand corner near Seattle with my name, because it took individuals getting together and talking. And I won't go on about it at length, but because one of my colleagues in this struggle is an historian who did lots of oral history on it, it's recorded. If you Google Judah Shapiro, Women's Liberation Seattle, you get all kinds of stories about what we did. And we were doing it at the same time that people were doing very similar things elsewhere. We had an unusual situation in Seattle, so we ended up having 3 different competing women's liberation groups representing all the ideologies. So the other reason I don't quite like the label feminist, some of it was that it reflects this staying within the confines of existing society. But the other is this creepy radicalism, which is a slightly insane acting out things. And that's still my view on it. Some of my students come to me all interested in this wages for housework movement. And I explained that this was, when that didn't get enough attention, they formed the English Collective of Prostitutes. Because it's acting out. Now, I don't want to knock acting out struggles only. I recently read about that. You know, what are people trying to do when they do these shock horror things? I shouldn't try to reason with them the way I would with you, that isn't going to get what you want, because it's not what they're doing. What they're doing is expressing themselves. It's expressive politics. But there was too much of that. We had one group like that. And we still have it with this sort of shock, let's do it this way. There's some value to it, but most of it seems not to work. I'm willing to have random control trials in which we try to relate to people directly and we try to shock them. But I don't think it works terribly well. The other thing that happened in our situation as we molecularly built the women's liberation movement and made big changes. The very first abortion referendum was in the state of Washington, and we had badges, buttons as you call them in America, with a coat hanger on them, and we had generally a very active campaign. And in some sense, I'm sorry that Roe versus Wade overtook it, because I think that if it had to be fought for everywhere, as opposed to the Supreme Court ruling it, that the strength of the movement to defend abortion rights would be stronger now. But that doesn't mean I wish they'd ruled the other way. I just wish that there hadn't been such a from above situation. So there was a great deal like that, and that was within the confines of bourgeois society, but it moves things forward. Women who can have these and are not worried and panicked about being pregnant, like my generation at university, when there was no legal abortion, and it was sort of the really life-changing in the worst way. They're freer to be here now, to be active. Is that enough? No. But I do think that, and I would really like from the audience, above all, I'll really end on this rather than just going on. This is the audience, I thought, where you started it. We can have an intelligent discussion of what #MeToo represents to us and how we should relate to it. Because, I mean, there's a wonderful Saturday Night Live cartoon you should see on YouTube, I mean, with caricature, in which couples are starting to talk about it. And as soon as somebody does, they all go, ooh, don't do it, don't do it. You know, there's no way you can put a foot forward without saying something. Either you don't care about the rape victims or you don't care about due process. You know, there's no way to do it. So we need a safe space of people who will not attack other people for their views. It's the opposite. We should turn the word safe space around. It means freedom to say what you want to say without being accused of the extreme case. Intelligent political culture and discussion, which I feel very strongly about, partly because I've spent most of my life since I left the Spartacus League worrying and thinking about the Soviet Union and then Russia, which lacks this political culture. You sit in a room and people talk past each other. So I would also encourage the audience not just to say what they came to say, but to address each other. Because even if you aren't rude to the other people, if you ignore them, we don't move the discussion forward. I know that's what you intend with your questions that we do. And so right now the question on the agenda was put by somebody else, which is, what does it mean for us? My own instinct is, that's why I want young people to answer it, that actually Me Too at this point is getting to be a distraction because it's driving out all the other questions. But maybe I'm not right. You know, I absolutely agree about the cumulative effect. We have to address that. We're not saying that one hand, one wolf whistle is terrible. The trouble is that that's what you have every day. But I don't observe that around. In fact, I don't observe it being like it was when, even 20 years ago. One of the reasons people have come forward is that we all know what's wrong. And we will then have to address other questions which are happening, which have to do with how far are you responsible for behaving like the ethos of a previous generation, which we've come up against, right? But it's an exciting time because it is a sort of third wave. I don't know what sparked it. I would be curious. Is it the equivalent of my grandchildren that I didn't have? Is it something that's happening that women have? I think that in the advanced capitalist countries, certainly, women have achieved all they can achieve legally. Now they want more. I don't know which way it is, but I do think that something is happening which is different. It deserves the title third wave. So anyway, it's an exciting and wonderful time. And another reason I don't love the word feminist is that it doesn't sit so well with men, but I don't have an alternative. And I've read 40 definitions last week, and there are about 20 I can agree with. You're for women's equality. And what I don't like is the idea that the first slice you take is women. Which comes down to saying, I would rather have a racist female than a male who believes in all the things I believe in. Social justice, equality of races, and so on. And so I don't have another word than feminism, so I think we need to take it over. That's my own sense, and make it our own meaning and drive out the others. But and in its relationship to Marxism, if Marxism is universal, it should also be universal, and then we wouldn't have feminists talking to Marxists because you wouldn't distinguish between those two identities. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, as I think moderator, chair, has indicated, I was kind of asked to do this at 1:10 for 2 o'clock. So my name is Sarah MacDonald. I'm speaking as a member of the CPGB, but just purely in a personal capacity. I didn't have the questions beforehand, so I will be rambling. I will be responding mostly to the discussion, and don't expect greatness. In fact, if you experience mediocrity, just be happy with that for now. So I guess, what is feminism? If you were to speak to somebody in normal society and they said, well, I'm not a feminist, you think, well, what kind of monster are you? You don't believe in women's liberation. But for me as a Marxist, it's not how I define myself. I define myself on class politics first. And I agree with an awful lot of what Roxanne said. In fact, I don't think there's going to be an awful lot of disagreement. There might be some around the hashtag #MeToo stuff, but we'll see what happens when I get to that part of my notes and see what comes out of my mouth, really. So, thinking about the idea of women's liberation, you think, well, liberation of half the population is not really just something that's desirable, is it? It's something that's absolutely fundamentally necessary moving forward, and that is part of, for me, that's part of the class struggle, that's part of the, and I do like the word emancipation, the emancipation of the whole of humanity. But like a lot of people in this room, I would take that from a class perspective first. Why? Because all of the other isms, all of the other issues, whether it's gay liberation, women's liberation, all of these things can be resolved through the emancipation of the whole of humanity by the working class as an agent, because the working class is the class that most necessarily has the advantage in overthrowing capitalist society. They're the biggest stakeholders in that. And whereas the women's movement can't emancipate the whole of society. So it goes that way around for me. But that's not to say, as Roxanne said, that you put this question on the back burner till a different time, till the other issues have been resolved, because it's fundamentally part of our movement is to address these questions. And I think that there are massive differences in the UK and in America, and there are in different cultures and different parts of the world, and these are related culturally and economically as well. And they say a woman's work is never done, and that's true, because you have, for most of us work, some of us work in professional jobs, work very long hours, work very hard, A lot of people work part-time or multiple jobs and have the second burden, again, of doing housework, of rearing children, of, again, looking at often the fundamentally, the caring in relationships, elderly and that kind of thing. A lot of that burden falls upon women in Western advanced capitalist societies, and even more so in other societies. So, so that's certainly an issue. And Judith was saying about the gains that have been made, and I think it's important not to skip over that, because massive gains have been made, massive gains. And it's not just that I've got a very cute little rucksack that doesn't give me a bad back when I'm carrying stuff around, but it's also, you know, the idea of education, as you say, abortion rights, equality, at least legally, whether that manifests itself financially or not. Representation, even down to taking out a mortgage or being able to order a full pint, not half pint in the pub, which even in the 1970s people couldn't do, women couldn't do. So again, these are issues. I'm sure there are plenty of better ones that people can come up with from the audience. Okay, the notion of pen lines and all that kind of thing is something, but then again, if you look at what's expected of not just women, but often women, about the way that we are told to look, the way we are told to dress, how we're criticised for dressing a certain way and not in another way, the amount of makeup, time you're supposed to spend preening, pulling the hair out of your face, and I do that. The amount of time that you spend sort of dieting or working out, or all of these things to fit a certain conformity, and that's within sort of Western, sort of white Western culture. If you then took that into Asian culture, African culture, then there would be different demands on the way women are supposed to look and act as well. So yes, there have been massive gains, but the idea that the women being criticised for their hemline is gone, I think isn't true. Right, so this may appear a little bit disjointed, but I think it's important. Roxanne started touching on the centenary of the Representation of the People Act in 1918, and I think that that's an interesting thing to have a conversation about, because it's where the mainstream has really co-opted something and turned it around into something that it isn't or wasn't. You know, if we look, I got really annoyed with Radio 4 Today programme at 6 o'clock in the morning as I was getting ready for work the other week, because, you know, they didn't mention working class men getting the vote at all at that point. It was like, there was a tiny bit where they mentioned, oh, it was women of property over 30, so middle class women that were married over 30, they got to have the vote. That was an aside, and this was seen as something that was almost given by the establishment in an ever forward trajectory towards progressiveness and tolerance and all these great British values that we have about democracy and respect and all that kind of thing that we're told that is inherently British and always has been. There was no mention of the Russian Revolution. There was no mention of the First World War. Why did working class men get the vote? Why did all working class men, universal male suffrage, happen at that point? People were armed, people were angry, and the Russian Revolution had just happened. It was a preventative measure. Why were not all women given the vote? Because the Labour Party would have been gotten into power at that point. Middle class women of property were more likely to not vote Labour, was another reason why. There was a very tactical decision for the establishment at that time. So I think that's interesting. The other interesting thing, apart from Amber Rudd, that came out of that was Theresa May, Nicola Sturgeon, and somebody else, can't remember.
Ruth Davidson, maybe.
Sorry?
Ruth Davidson?
Ruth Davidson, exactly. All sort of talking about this idea of safety for women in politics. And it was that, again, that idea of women get abusive tweets, or women get abusive comments, and all this kind of, this almost creating a safe space and creating this culture of victimhood, where you're actually dealing with the suffragettes who were brave women who created, created social disturbance, acts of violence, and all the rest of it, who risked and in some cases lost their lives for the vote. Very little, apart from people on the left, I've mentioned Sylvia Pankhurst. But she's the obvious heroine of that period, learned jiu-jitsu, fought to fight off the police, organised in the East End of London, you know, sort of relationships with Moscow and whatever else. You know, somebody that's clearly fundamental, but again, completely written out of the story, historically. So that's just one example that massively annoyed me the other week. But another one that is coming up soon, 8th of March, Women's Day, International Working Women's Day, is now international. It's all about Hillary Clinton or female CEOs. No, it's not. Where does it come from? The New York Machinist Strike. What happened on the International Women's Day March in 1917? Bread, Peace and Land, Petrograd strikers. That was started by women taking militant action. No mention of Colin Tyvzek in any of these things. I gave an assembly, it was great, for all of my secondary school for every day last year for a week on Women's Day, and it started at the beginning. So it didn't, you know, but that's not what is taught, realistically. That's not what is taught about what Women's Day is about. It's another thing that the establishment have made safe and they've taken on and made their own. Okay. Jumping on to hashtag #MeToo, Twitter is one of the few forms of social media I actually do use, but I hadn't really followed it massively other than what's been in the news. Yes, I agree, there are massive, massive differences between things that are genuine abuse, rape, sexual assault, and all of these kind of things, and there's also going on a bad date. There's also somebody saying the wrong thing or saying something, you know, or trying, you know, try it on a little bit. That is fundamentally different, and it demeans sexual assault if you're going to categorise or equate these things, because they are not. That doesn't mean that we don't live, there isn't sexism in society. Of course there is, and that you don't challenge it. Of course you do. But I think that you're always creating a culture of victimhood, and that's what I have a problem with safe space. One of the things I have a problem with the whole notion of safe spaces is that they become, you make yourself a victim. Rather than you being able to stand up and fight something, it's almost, you're wrapping yourself up in cotton wool. I have lots of, we could go into that whole debate. We did an awful lot around left unity. I don't want to massively go back around the whole safe spaces culture. It's very hypocritical in my experience as well. But I think what's fundamental about all of this is the question of power relations. Right? If you are working in Hollywood and your producer says you have to sleep with me in order to get your next job or to ever work again, that puts you in a very weak bargaining position. If you're in a power relationship where you can tell somebody to fuck off, then that's very different. If you're in a power relationship, you know, where you having to do what somebody else says because there isn't, you're not empowered yourself, or collectively you're not organised to be empowered to challenge that, that's a different matter. So I do think that that's an important thing. Very quickly, because I've been told I have 2 minutes, I didn't actually think I was going to use up all my time. Quick things around, I don't believe in wages for housework. I have seen interesting things. When I was in Vienna, I did the Vienna Marathon a few years back, and a few of us went to Karl Marx Hof, which was really interesting because they collectivised a lot of the things. So the women actually worked downstairs doing collective laundry, collective food preparation. It was all very smart. But the point is, you just collectivised domestic drudgery. You know, it was all women doing these doing these really boring menial tasks, cleaning, housework, childcare. But it was made more bearable by the fact it was done collectively, but it didn't emancipate them. So I thought that was quite an interesting social experiment. I think the preconceptions of women, I think this comes up not so much from discussions today, but what I've heard in the left, often or in the feminist movement, is that, oh, women are more cooperative, or women are somehow inherently more progressive. I did hear one comrade once say, oh, isn't it great that we've got these women like Nicola Sturgeon and Green Party woman, whose name Karen Lucas, and the Welsh women. Anyway, they're all these women that are all going to be so. Why? Because they're women. You know, was Margaret Thatcher progressive Christian? Is Theresa May progressive Christian? No, that's ridiculous. The idea that women on a panel at interviews are going to sort of be more equal, or be more sort of give more opportunities to women, I would question. Women notoriously in rape juries trial sort of rape cases are more likely to find against the woman victim, or to say, oh, she was drunk, she was wearing a short skirt and all that kind of thing. So the idea that women will naturally have solidarity with other women, or by having women representation or tokenistically on boards or whatever else is going to benefit women overall, I think is wrong. So again, I would argue that while we should be promoting opportunities to develop women, I think that this is the last point, I guess, that's probably more pertinent. On the left, there are so many demands on our time as women, and we need to develop the women cadre that we have, recognising the additional pressure that they might have, whatever that may be, in terms of work, childcare, and all the things that under capitalist society, I don't think that you should go out of your way to tokenistically promote women on 50-50 or anything like that, but you do have to recognise that it might be more difficult and look at how do you create a culture where women are encouraged to speak, women are put onto platforms, women are encouraged to read, to study, and to build confidence, because I think that's something that is reflected in the left, but also in wider society. If you look in the education system, or I think probably more widely, women are underrepresented and less vocal.
Thank you to all of our panelists for their opening remarks, and now we're going to allow about max 5 minutes for each panelist to respond, and we'll just go into seat. And then after that, we'll open it.
I will start by responding to a couple of points that Judith made. It sounded like what you were saying, Judith, was that I was potentially, and maybe others on the left, other Marxists, underestimate the progress already made by the women's liberation movement, which wasn't my intention at all. In that 10 minutes is a very short amount of time, you can't cover much, but I've been reading a lot about it over the last week, and it is remarkable, and I can appreciate when you live through that you can really feel that difference. And we certainly shouldn't underestimate it, and that is why it's so important to fight for those reforms. It makes a difference to our lives now, and also those things are always being attacked, so we have to keep fighting for them anyway. But we best do that by understanding that we have to change the framework. And just to use the short skirt thing as an example, I mean, I think also, I mean, I'm also a teacher in the public sector, and they're sort of fairly liberal, really big, comprehensive school, and even there, it is absolutely remarkable the conversations that I have with students, young people, and the other teachers. The attitudes are astounding. The conversations about skirt lengths. I mean, we had to get some female teachers involved. Had to explain to male teachers that if you are a taller girl, then your skirt's going to come up higher on your legs. That's just what happens. And that it's a responsibility of professional men to be professional. We had an instance where a head of year who had pastoral care was basically, without even realising he was doing it, sexualising the girls around him, saying how they should be dressing and stuff. And it's like, well, no, that started off in your head. Like, these girls are just wearing some jewellery or whatever. Like, get over yourself and allow these girls to wear whatever they want to wear. But the conversation was pretty 1950s. So things have changed, but they haven't changed in some ways as well, is my point. I'd be interested to hear what you think about the publication Women in Revolution, Judith. This was a useful educational tool for me that the Spartacus League produced. I think some of the work they did was really important, but I think some of this really successful work that you're describing was done by Marxist revolutionaries intercepting the feminist left, recruiting feminists, trying to bridge the gap. And they could do that because they had the most coherent framework, as opposed to the kind of non-Marxist nonsense of things like wages for housework and stuff like that. The radical acting out stuff, which still exists in various forms. So yes, we have to move things forward, within the confines of bourgeois society. But and I think so. Essentially, I think we agree, but maybe our emphasis is different there. But you know, the cumulative thing, like the Harvey Weinstein thing, it just shows how deeply entrenched it all is. Like again, I feel like I'm kind of protected from it, working in the public sector. I'm a teacher, so I'm surrounded by a lot of women as well. But you know, I talk to friends who work in corporate settings or any other type of setting, like the blatant sexism, harassment, assaults that happen all the time they're so common that you know it's so sickening that we're still dealing with it on that level. So, but you know, you asked the question, why is it happening? The Me Too campaign. You know, I do think it was as a bit of a distraction, partly to distract from the chaos of American society in particular. The fabric of capitalist society in general, the conditions of the working class worsening every day in such a serious way. This is something that people can then focus their energies on. I'm not saying it's not an important conversation, but anyway, I'm probably coming towards, I just want to end on one thing then, which is Hillary Clinton, you mentioned. It might be a bit unfair to say this because Laurie Penny is not here today, and I'd be interested to get her reply, maybe even in writing, but she very clearly supported Hillary Clinton in the presidential election. And for me, that's the logical conclusion of her politics, of socialist feminist politics. It really came down to the fact that she's a woman. That's it. It's a question of feminism versus socialism, which, for anyone who knows about Hillary Clinton's record and what was at stake, it was nothing to do with that. It's really easy to hate Trump, but we need to also question what kind of world would we be living in right now if Hillary Clinton was president. So the fact that she's a woman that talks a bit left on female issues makes her more dangerous as far as I'm concerned, because it distracts from her very, very dangerous politics. Anyway.
What I wanted to address myself to, since it's coming up, is the 8th of March, which you raised. Because I have the same irritation that they stole it from me, and amusement when my students tell me that Goldman Sachs has at their entryway a giant mural dedicated to the forthcoming 8th of March. And I want it back, but it's not the right attitude I want to argue. That is that if we're really serious about the fact that the role of the working class isn't that we're all going to be ground down into proletarians and then, in fact, we'll have a revolution, but that the idea that the working class by its position, even if it's in smaller units, it's still located in large enterprises, that it has the ability to work collectively that others don't, that it will cause the emancipation of everybody. I'll use the word emancipation. And that's important, and I worried last night that there's a certain amount that doesn't accept it. There's a tension between the kind of democracy that I know people in this room overwhelmingly share, on the one hand, and the view that the working class is going to do the dictating, which was the view of the comrade who was talking a lot about Chairman Avakian. Every time he did it, I thought it was an own goal, so I didn't object. But the point is that we really have to interrogate that, as people say. I know the ultimate to me, which got me uneasy, probably ate at me for years in the Spartacus League, was an incident in which people driving across the United States, what you used to do to go to left meetings if you were on the West Coast is 6 of you got into a car and you didn't sleep, and one person drove, and then you took turns, another person kept the driver awake, and the two of the, and they happened to be larger males, invented a thing called driver's democracy. And driver's democracy was a deliberate joke on their part about proletarian democracy as opposed to real democracy. Okay, driver's democracy meant only the drivers got to decide if we smoked or not, or we stopped to pee or not, right? and where, which doesn't matter if you're male or female, and as Simone de Beauvoir noted. And so, and they yet haven't invented it. Please do invent it, something that will make us equal in the woods. I've tried them all. But the point is that, and you know, I might be accused of trivializing it. By the way, on the rucksack, it isn't a woman's right to wear a rucksack. People didn't have a right to look unseemly. That was what was weird. Okay, and there was a period in the history of the rucksack backpack in which I used to buy them in New York when they didn't have them 1 year, because suddenly it wasn't in. Right? And we had forces in society that were much more repressive. And it isn't always healthy that those bounds got broken, but mostly it was. So anyway, I don't think it's trivial, those things. I think they do affect people. But I do believe that we should not, we can talk about the history of International Women's Day, including wonderful photographs that you can blow up of Petrograd on the 8th of March, that is the 23rd of February, on their calendar. And most of the slogans, I mean, most of the people are women, and a good deal is about the fact that they were home because they weren't at the front. But there also are demands to the 8-hour day, and there are placards. We can talk about that, but we shouldn't try to take it back. We should say, we gave you this, right? Enjoy, rather than it's ours. Only the working class can appreciate International Women's Day. Only the working class can do this, right? It's the job to be the front runners rather than the sole owners of the values that I think of as socialism. When I think that there's a future for socialism, the big question you said. I don't believe there is in the near future for a socialist society, but these ideals are very important and they drive us forward, and they include the gains that the reason I mentioned it on gains was that you emphasized, and you overstated it if you go back and read it, nothing can come of having a bourgeois movement, and that's not true, and you wouldn't think that. What you want to say is, it'll stop there, it'll have to be started again. The reason we have a third wave is we had regression, okay, and I worry a lot about a backlash, because I went through backlash periods. But I think, as I said, that, you know, International Women's Day should be for everybody, including men, but also not be confined to being proletarian. Just remind people where it came from, like many, many other good things.
Yeah, I'm going to start with the ridiculous anecdote on skirt lengths, just because I think it's always a good place to start. But a friend of mine worked in an all-girls school, a male friend of mine worked in an all-girls school, and they had they had kilts, and they had a very specific length that the kilt needed to be. And there was a distance between the sock and the kilt. There needed to be a certain measurement in inches. So there would be a point where the teachers would have to go around and check, stop the students on the stairwell in the corridor and check the length of the skirt, the distance between the sock and the bottom of the skirt. To the point where this became difficult for members of staff, so all students, all girls, were expected to carry a piece of cardboard that was the length between the skirt and the socks. And it became not only a punishable offence not to have the right length between the skirt and the socks, but also if you were found to be walking the corridors not in possession of your bit of card that measured it. How ridiculous an approach to policing the way that young women dress. But, I mean, and these things still go on to a greater or lesser extent in sort of, as you say, liberal, progressive, comprehensive secondary schools. And I'm sure worse in private schools where all the kids are supposed to look like little ice cream sellers. With their right, anyway, moving on to, I told you it was ridiculous. So I think there's an important thing to mention about, I know that Laurie Penny's not here, but the whole question of Hillary Clinton. I think that you got me instead.
She's not here.
Yeah, you got me instead though. But you know, this whole, and I think it's less so on the left, but I think within wider society, this idea of Hillary Clinton would have been progressive, Hillary Clinton as a woman, Hillary Clinton isn't Trump. That's the point. She isn't Trump, and that and I don't think that, again, you can put an equals between them, but there are certain, if you look at her record in the Middle East, if you look at her record on a whole load of things, the idea that Hillary Clinton would have been some sort of paragon of virtue is ridiculous. But I know a lot of female friends, particularly female friends from North America, that have that opinion. On the question of the 8th of March, do I want to take it back? Kind of. But it's not about that. I guess for me, it's about the idea that just like 1918 and women having the right to vote, or certain women having the right to vote, ignoring male universal suffrage and the reasons why, it's about the historical context of that. It's about this idea as well that you're suggesting to people that you don't have to fight for anything, because the benevolent powers that be, because we're on this trajectory towards an ever more progressive, ever more tolerant, ever more democratic society, because that is the way that it just happens, that will be handed down to you. And again, it's that establishment co-opting of that rather than this was fought for, and this is how it was fought for, and this is how it was won, and they didn't want to give it to us. So when it comes to women's suffrage or universal male suffrage, again, I think that's something that's crucial. The idea that International Women's Day was part of a fight, and it was part of a struggle absolutely about the emancipation of men, to try and end the war. People's husbands and sons were being slaughtered. The idea that you were ending famine and all that kind of, it wasn't just for women, but it was again, you know, we're talking 1917, obviously the New York Machinist strike was different back in anyway, so yeah, so that idea, it's not just about, right, this is ours and we want it back, it's about acknowledging history and also the culture that you have to fight in a militant way for things to get them sometimes. So yes, and I think that sometimes when we have these conversations, whether it's in the left, in the trade union movement, or in sort of bourgeois society, we have a tendency to do this to the exclusion of men. And the idea that the women's question isn't a question for men is wrong, because because if we are going to liberate the whole of humanity, it's not just women that are going to address women's liberation. Men are too. If we are going to change sexist attitudes that do exist, then that involves educating men as well, and developing men and boys. If there is an issue around sexual assault, men are occasionally victims, or often victims, boys are often victims, but they're all, and more often than not, they're the perpetrators of it. So again, culturally, these conversations can't happen without addressing these with men and educating men in the movement. So again, I hope I didn't come across as saying that this was something that's, because for me, that's something that's very important, is that it's something that we do collectively.
Okay, questions?
A few years ago, we published an essay in the Platypus Review under the title Gender and the New Man, written by Mia Damschak, an activist academic in prison in Berlin. And her thesis was that the project of the new man, or the neue Mensch, the proletarian Soviet Union, had, despite the radical shift they made in emancipation, universal male character. That even if the goal was to integrate all of mankind, it was like man. The women had to become like men in a certain way, that the progress was going through the masculinization of women. It's, for example, mirrored in face, in like how faces changed through like the 20s, for example. And I just thought I should ask you what you think about this thesis, because it's quite common within a broader non-Marxist feminist tendencies.
Okay, let's
I think we'd rather you talk first.
Yeah.
And then we'll take it.
That's my general.
Rather than answering each one.
Judith, you don't make it clear that what you're talking about all these games for women, you're talking about imperialist countries, right?
No.
No, and you're
I'm not. Let's talk about Rwanda.
No, hold
Spoke
on.
about
No, hold on. You didn't.
Okay, sorry.
You didn't. And the thing is that the question we should address is that the capitalist system in the imperialist countries has been quite willing to give rights and progressive things to women and gay people, and adjust to those things, and that takes away from, you know, a revolutionary sort of thing developing, because it does have the ability to say, we'll grant these people's rights and we'll take their oppression into account in a way that you don't in the oppressed country.
Well, I don't share the schema of oppressed and oppressor countries, and that's where we differ primarily. And I continue, even though I don't consider myself a Marxist, I continue to believe that your view is not Marxist, if I were judging it from an independent point of view, in the same way that I tend to judge that the IBT is the real Spartacist League. That I think I know what I'm talking about, that no one would have thought about that the whole of the country is doing that, and that some imperialists are sitting there granting things. The reality is that for various reasons, women in Africa have long had more of the kind of rights that we can talk about. It doesn't make them emancipated. That's another reason that feminism and Marxism have an uneasy marriage or whatever. I'll give you as a puzzle that in China, I don't think there's any doubt that women in the 50s and 60s until 1978 were encouraged and had more equality by many of the measures that we had, like wage equality, jobs. On the other hand, when the reform started and this enormous increase in welfare happened, women became more unequal. And I teach a class in August in Beijing, and I put it to the students, which would you rather be, starving equally during the Great Leap Forward famine, or would you rather be very unequal now at the chance? And I think that's the level at which we need to look at things, not imperialists deciding that and the oppressed. Because this schema, it worked for a little while for a small group of people in advanced industrial countries who wrote off their own working class. And it doesn't correspond with any reality about what happens between countries, which is much more complex. I'm not going into it now, but I think it's also interesting to look at exactly what happened to women in the Soviet Union, with its ups and downs. But it doesn't fit any of your schema. It may make you happy, and a few other people, but it doesn't fit reality, and it can't explain it very well.
Do any of the other panelists want to take that up? Or perhaps, and you know, if I may, with all due respect, the reason that we tend to take one question at a time is so that, of course, those questions do actually get answers. So if somebody would like to answer the new man question, I think that would be, you know, nice for our audience member who took the time to ask that question. But otherwise, I will take more questions.
I've got a couple of, one point, the new man thing. Do women behave or are expected to behave more like men sometimes? But I suppose that people are a product of their environment and different conditions. So in the workplace, in certain behaviours will get you promoted and certain won't, for example. And certain things are seen as being very male and certain things being seen as very female. So when I'm assertive, I'm aggressive. When a man's assertive or aggressive, then, you know, he's behaving in a leadership fashion. So you do see these things, and you do see these things within, I think particularly within the workplace. But you know, I don't know that it's so binary that there are always male behaviours and female behaviours. I think there's a lot of crossover and a lot of conditioning into the way that people are expected to behave in different circumstances as well. So, you know, in certain, again, boys in certain circumstances will be expected to be macho and play football or whatever, but boys in certain circumstances will, you know, will be expected to be involved in theatre or music or all these different things. So again, it depends on the cultural environment, I think, very much.
something quickly on this one? I argue this discussion quite a lot as well, and like you said, often in kind of non-Marxist circles as well. In fact, I will refer to my workplace again, because I actually work with quite a lot of feminists. There's just a disproportionate number in the English department in my school, and they're always talking about it. And me and my colleague did an experiment the other day, because people call her quite brash and sort of aggressive and so on, and she explained to me that she actually quite consciously changes her behaviour to be more like a man. And it's not that she doesn't understand that these things are socially conditioned in the first place, very much so, but that actually sometimes, so for example, she says when she wants to get something done, she will adopt a style that's considered to be more like a man. Or, for example, if she wants to shut down a group of sexist boys she's teaching, she will adopt a certain style that unfortunately gains her some respect. And then as she builds the relationship, her style might soften a bit. Now, the kind of quite hardcore feminists I work with is like, right, well, no, men need to be more like women. They need to use more tag questions. They need to be more open. They need to leave more space, not interrupt, and so on. Which I think is also true. But the problem is we could carry on having these conversations all the time, but it's a cultural problem. If we need to change the conditions in which we live to really see what's the potential for maximised communication, or the words that we use, which are also a product of our environment. So although I think they're important conversations, I think people get really bogged down with them in a kind of distracted way really as well.
Okay, I'm going to let our camera operator take the next question. And if I've nodded at you, I've written you down, and I promise
Cool.
to get to you.
Yeah, I think that all three of you seem to have weaved into your discussion a kind of like a notion of biological essentialism. One of the first things that you said, Roxanne, was that these mainstream political figures such as Theresa May, Sturgeon, Merkel, have shown how irrelevant gender is. I thought that was quite an interesting comment, especially with what we were just saying about performing being masculine, and perhaps a link between this kind of national self-determination and the fact that a lot of those mainstream political figures that you picked out that are women are also linked very strongly to nationalism, and something to do with the body as a kind of destiny, or if gender is irrelevant, and how you can fit between. I think I went to a talk with someone recently, and they, in a similar way to what you just said, use they pronouns when they're in situations, political situations with men, to create a kind of gender ambiguity. I was just wondering where you thought maybe gender might collapse, or where trans people fit into your kind of idea of that.
If you want to respond, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, in general, my preference is for taking more questions, but if you want me to... okay. So, talk about biological essentialism. What I mean when I say that gender is irrelevant is, for these women, is that their political programme is the ultimate thing that determines their actions. They happen to be women. Gender is not irrelevant in our lives, and particularly as it becomes part of our identity, or if it's part of our identity and that in itself becomes political. So the oppression of trans women, for example, is a particular experience that is different to a cisgendered woman. These things should be dealt with very explicitly, and that particular type of oppression within a capitalist framework, and then if we go into a transitional kind of society, if we manage to change the social conditions, who knows how these things will all fit together. Maybe gender will break down. I think it will, in a really big way. Just it's going to be mind-boggling how we think about things when we break out of this framework. But to go back to the original point when I said it was irrelevant, I was really talking about the fact that class, this is an example where class is the most important thing always, because
yeah, I would just like to clarify. I didn't have necessarily a problem with you saying that. I thought it was quite critical, and like
okay.
I thought it was interesting.
I answered your other point though, but
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Maybe we'll take with yes, Argyle.
Title of this panel is Marxism and Feminism, and the relationship between these two has often been thought in terms of a supposed distinction between a main or principal contradiction between workers and capitalists, and secondary contradictions like, subjects like women's question and like migrants and so on, and which has led many so-called post-Marxist theoreticians like Ernesto Laclau or Chantal Mouffe to rail against the supposed Marxist economism, because supposedly Marxism always puts economy first and then only all the other contradictions or forms of oppression. And in my opinion, actually, this supposed distinction between principal and secondary contradictions is not at all Marxist, but is in itself already a sign of the Stalinist reformist decay of Marxism itself. Because a really revolutionary Marxism and, let's say, feminism or women's emancipation, liberation would need each other, the one as well as the other, at least in three different terms. First of all, strategically, because if you want to fight a successful class struggle, you need solidarity in the class among male and female workers, and often female workers and also black or migrant workers are the more radical ones than the white male workers. Then, of course, you need to collectivize the economy in order to collectivize housework, provide childcare and so on. And then, in order to fight against sexist stereotypes, you would also need to expropriate the media industry, which constantly produces, at least contributes to reproducing all these stereotypes. And so if you have a situation in 1968 where a supposedly communist party in France only fights for 30% wage raise, then this is not at all Marxist. It is a question of thoroughly reformist, degenerated Stalinist party who reifies the workers and capitalist relationship, who just wants to continue to go on with capitalism, and the same as it's being nationalist and racist and so on and so on. So I think all these so-called secondary questions are intrinsically linked to the struggle against capitalism. It's all one, so to speak.
And maybe we'll take a question. Lauren,
Don't put it on my face. I actually did want to go back to Marxism. Because yes, it's disappointing that Lori Penny's not in this room, but then I also realized it's rare for, I think, them to have the opportunity with three what I believe are Marxists in your own rights. Well, Judith,
I'm not sure.
exactly, okay, let's get there. Let's
I
get to
know
why
what
not.
Marxism is, whether I am one is another question.
Maybe, right. Sure, maybe we can get to why not. And so, yeah, part of this is anecdotal too, sort of a moment about arguing over Me Too with what is basically a CEO of a startup in Berlin who's a close friend of mine, who's obviously strongly supportive of Me Too. And, you know, I had a bar with a whole bunch of women that work for her. I began an argument about the potential limitations of Me Too, the potential authoritarianism of Me Too, the limited scope, the emphasis that it's mostly appealing to middle class or upper middle class women. And, you know, it came obviously up to a limit. And of course it was like, yeah, we'll support you in socialism, Lori, like that, like, right? But I kept pressing. And then at some point, meaning I can't believe it, I have to actually say, cutting a man's penis off doesn't actually produce justice, like the argument was there for them. And I was like, well, maybe this is actually would be justice for like what's happened to women across history. And to which of course I was very disturbed. But you know, I'm trying to get to my own experience as a Marxist is trying to get to the social political problems that women face in society today, finding myself having difficulty in convincing them. Of course they weren't like that in itself was their own politics, and I can't move them in one evening, but you know, it actually brought to me sort of this question of like, what actually does Marxism have to offer to women today? And it's because it's very part of my sort of politicization of like actually experiencing, yes, there's so few women in politics, there's structural reasons for women, fewer women on the left, confidence issues, etc. But yet, that is, you don't need Marxism to make that point. At least I don't think, right? So, what is the problem, I think, perhaps of Marxism with regards to women, is the question. What is the problem that Marxism has to address? Is it a question of, like, is the point through Marx's argument for socialism that we would overcome the idea of woman, right? That we get post-gender in a real way. Is it just about labor and wages? Is it something more? Is it about, I mean, I've raised this before in a similar kind of like, are we aiming for something more than equality? What are actually Marxists? Like, because like, this is like a rare opportunity that then we have. Because Laura Benny would have obviously just made her, Benny would have moved the direction and the conversation in another direction. But now I actually think that Judith would be interested in knowing also your departure of Marxism, because you're very proud of your women's liberation, but you are more ambivalent about your Marxist history. So I think that's interesting, and because you also raised last night, and you didn't specify this idea that, identity politics emerge as a result of the failure of the new left. And we're kind of living with that legacy today. So that the failure of the new left, the failure of Marxists in the 60s. And so I'm still thinking, again, sort of if we can actually draw the conversation to sort of what's Marxism's role in this conversation.
Does anybody want to take up either this kind of statement we had, argument, or the question that Laura just posed?
I'd be happy to start that. I'll start with the comrade at the back who was talking about PCF and France 68 principle versus the secondary question of the division of sex and gender. I agree that if we really relegated the woman question to being completely secondary in a kind of very layered sense, that, I mean, I don't even think that would be Stalinism. Stalinism is the negation of women's rights in many ways, very explicitly. And the PCF's role in 68 was very much, it was partly to contain this pre-revolutionary situation. I don't think that was a revolutionary program that was offering the way out. I think it was doing the opposite in that instance. But I do think that you've got a point. I think looking at the history of the Bolsheviks is quite useful to see how does the question of women's liberation and integrating women into the movement really fit into human emancipation. Lenin in particular was very, he was very forward-thinking and actually because he knew how necessary it was, that's why, to create organizations that mobilized women, educated women, drew women into the workforce in a context where women were much less educated, almost 100% illiterate, not that long ago, not that long before 1917. So how do we solve that problem? Now, we've got different problems in Britain 2018, but one of the problems we have is that there are very, very few women in the movement. How do we draw people in? I mentioned transitional organizations that, it's not about treating it as a secondary question. It's a strategic question in the sense that we can't have revolution without it. But the line I'm trying to draw is that what feminists don't understand is that at the bottom of it all is class, and if we don't start with that perspective, we'll always be going around in circles. We'll always be working within this framework, and that will ultimately betray everybody. And feminists also acknowledge that it's a structural problem, but they're not willing to challenge that structure. So Laurie asked the question, what can Marxism offer women? Well, today. I still think Marxism offers the way out. It's the only way out. Because if we want to change the world, we need a method, we need a coherent method to do that. Now, I mentioned in my introduction a revolutionary party. I think we need to build a revolutionary party on a Leninist model, as you know. I think that it's a necessary starting point. It is not the only thing that's going to do it. Exactly how that party organises itself. We don't have a mass revolutionary workers' party in this country. We don't have one that has a coherent Marxist programme, a mass revolutionary Marxist workers' party anywhere at the moment. But for me, that doesn't mean that the necessary starting point has changed. And I think we have to recognise that clash, because it reminds me of something that Judith was saying. You said, Judith, that we are putting too much emphasis on Marxism and changing overall framework, and not recognising the gains that have already happened. But it's not just about that. You talked about making feminism universal and Marxism universal rather than clashing. But they do clash, because they want something very different, and actually recognising sometimes even the reactionary role that feminism can play, and the way that it contains struggles, which also happened in Russia, when the feminist movement grew and actually contained the working class women's demands, because they wanted to maintain the status quo whilst getting a few little gains for themselves.
When are you talking about?
When am I talking about?
Yes.
Around 1912. But I mean, it was an ongoing process. But and also at the turn of the century as well, which was the case across Europe. You know, why did feminism come about in the first place? It was a bourgeois movement. When it became a movement, it was about making things better for women as they were going into the workplace as well. I mean, I don't know whether I fully answered Laurie's question, but I mean, maybe Sarah or others want to answer that as well.
Well, I would generally agree with what you said. I mean, my other question is, because it offers you a way out, because it offers emancipation in the future, because it offers you a structure of how to do that. But today, what does Marxism offer women today? What does Marxism offer men today? Or so. What does it? Why it offers you Saturday afternoons at Goldsmiths? It offers what does it offer any of us today? Well, education, but it's not. I guess for me, it's not about today in this room. This is part of a process of how we get to where we're going, hopefully, and then it offers emancipation for all of humanity. I don't know if I agree with Roxanne about the previous comrade's point about whether gender will break down or become irrelevant, because I think that there is, obviously there are some people that will identify with a different gender, but in general speaking, most people probably identify with the gender they are. Gender roles, I think, will break down, but I don't think the gender itself will break down, because people will have a biological gender that most people will probably stick to. That's not to be dismissive of people being trans, but I think there's generally that would be true. But gender roles inside women will probably still have the actual bearing of children and stuff like that, but the roles of child rearing or how work is organised in society in general will change, leisure time will change, all of these things will change. So I think that's an issue. I take slight issue with the notion that minorities are more radicalised in general, or oppressed groups are more radicalised in general, because I don't think that's historically true. It may be in certain cases at certain times, but you just need to look at the left and look at the room This room has probably more women in it than most left meetings would have, probably. But it's still not nowhere near 50% women. If we look at if we look at race and look around the room, again, and that is reflected in the left much more widely. So the idea that if you're more disenfranchised, that you're more radicalised isn't necessarily true. You've probably got less time to read, you've probably got less opportunity. So again, why are women not as active in left politics or politics more generally? So I don't buy into this notion that oppressed groups are more likely to be more radical than non-oppressed groups.
Judith, would you like to take this? I think Lori
Yeah,
questioned.
I mean,
Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
I mean, the question of oppressed groups is that you're approaching it appropriately. It's an empirical question rather than a theoretical one. We have to look and see. And most types of oppression do cause people to act on it more. But the question of women is particularly complex that way, because the oppression of women also takes the form of internalizing norms, like femininity. I don't mean that there's no such thing as femininity, just that I don't think I remember a group of people more decisive that women's job is to be supportive than late Soviet women, I'll put it that way. My friends explaining that, you know, the woman is the neck and the man is the head, and the woman basically manipulates the man. And showing him which way to turn. And they all loved it, and like most Russian intellectuals of that period, or Soviet, including Ukraine, that they also thought they'd invented the phrase, whereas I would hear it in 19 kitchens. And so you do internalize it in a different way even than race, right? That the Uncle Tom phenomenon that people have described in the United States, people still didn't really believe they were as inferior as women tend to believe they like it that way. What it's going to be like, I'm with you on, I don't know. Okay, I've been looking at, I think when we look at the direction of change, we get a clue. For example, women and men definitely differ far out on the more intelligence as we measure it on Q. Women don't have the same spatial perception as men. And this relates to me, any of you who have great ability to find your way around it, and you're female, it doesn't relate to you. What fascinates me is that that gap is closing. Okay, so the question isn't there, but which way it's going. And that tells us something about whether it's nature or nurture. So I think that that's, we're not going to know, but it's been happening before our eyes as well. But it's there. Women bear the children. That is going to be a fact. It's a sort of bottom line, right? As far as I know, actually, no, I take that back. I read about it. We're just going to have clones, right? And they'll be delivered by flying cars, right? I don't know how far that will go, actually.
Hannah?
Yeah, I was actually interested in, I mean, Laurie mentioned that we have a panel on Marxists or Marxist feminists. So my question is, what do you think defines the difference between the bourgeois liberal feminist movement and the Marxist feminist movement? And like concerning the past, what you have achieved, and also concerning your demands. Because, I mean, maybe that's a weird question, but I'm actually wondering, like, if there hadn't been a Marxist feminist movement, like, would there have been the same changes by the bourgeois movement? So maybe you can say something to that. I'd be interested.
Okay, how about in the black shirt in the third row?
I'm Barbara from the IBT, comrade of Roxanne. So many points to cover. This goes to Hannah, that Hannah asked about Marxist feminism. I mean, I I'm a Marxist, which means I'm not a feminist. And I often in my day-to-day life get very shocked reactions to that. You know, I think Sarah said it about what kind of monster are you? And I think Roxanne's explained in her talk about the counterposition between these. And a lot of Marxists call themselves Marxist feminists. It's like they don't want to offend anyone. But I think this ideological difference is very, very important, that as Roxanne's explained. And I guess this also ties in with Laurie's question about what does Marxism have to offer today. And I mean, I find this conception that the left is dead really rather bizarre, because the left is here and it's right now in this room and we're talking. But the left is very weak at the moment. And I've been thinking, as we've been talking about, the kind of historical aspect to this, which I think some of the original questions were touching on, and the going back to the 1970s and the women's liberation movement. And the Spartacist League that Judith was a supporter of in the 1970s is not the Spartacist League you may know today. It was a revolutionary Marxist organisation then, and it's the one that the IBT claims as part of our heritage. And the work that the Spartacist League did in the 1970s with the women's liberation movement is incredibly important, and there's a magazine called Women and Revolution that Roxanne mentioned that covers a lot of this. And the Spartacist League was taking notice of the women's liberation movement in a way that a lot of the left wasn't doing, but also being unambiguously clear that they were not feminists, they were Marxists. But the women's liberation is a project for Marxists, because Marxism is about the emancipation, the liberation of everyone, of all the oppressed, of all the exploited. And so they were raising these issues. But I also think in the 1970s, the women's movement as a whole was in a way more left-wing than what we see. A lot of the early issues were about really concrete demands that really changed women's lives, like childcare and abortion rights. And those of us that came after have benefited from all those things. But in my earliest political memories of 1980s probably, by that point that had already regressed. The feminism that I came across was about the representation of women in the media, it was about pornography, it was about kind of ideas of women. And partly that was because some of these things had been already achieved, but it was also a kind of right-wing tilt as the more radical days of the 1970s had slipped away and society as a whole was moving to the right. And I think we see that with this emphasis today on sexual violence. I mean, not to say that sexual violence isn't a problem, but sexual violence is very much tied up with these economic points with society as a whole, as everyone has talked about, that it ties in with this idea about the gains. I mean, we have made huge gains since that point, through my lifetime and before, that but it has been more gains for privileged women. And to go back to the Hillary Clinton thing, a lot of people I know there was that big debate between Clinton and Trump, and everyone was cheering her on because she was fighting misogyny. She was fighting for her right as a millionaire to be president. It doesn't necessarily mean that is fighting for all women's rights. And that it's not that one particular woman in one particular country, imperialist countries, are liberated and women in non-imperialist countries are not liberated. But the status you have in society as a whole shows the amount to which you are liberated. And as a young woman, a white woman in an imperialist country, I was brought up by a mother with a job and encouraged me to do everything that I wanted to do. And I did not feel particularly oppressed, really. I mean, obviously there's aspects of it, but I kind of knew I was one of the lucky ones as well. And then I had a baby and another baby, and I began to notice a lot of things about the structure, even in our relatively privileged society, the way in which me and my partner were kind of channeled into roles, the way in which as soon as you had a child, the whole structures of the family within capitalism started to limit your choices. And I began to realise that there's a lot of things still there. And this thing about family, and where I'm going to with this is about what capitalism does. And the family is a very important part of the way capitalism works in order to use different roles for men and women in order to maintain that structure. So that is why I'm not a feminist, I'm a Marxist, because it's these structures that ultimately we have to get rid of, or we'll make gains, but the gains will lose them again.
So Nancy, you're next. Are you on this kind of topic of Marxism and feminism? If not, I think we'll maybe let.
Okay, let's go back and then I can.
Okay.
I just want to say briefly, I don't think anybody in this room considers the Spartacus League relevant enough yet, still, that it's worth my discussing why it may have had good ideas, but believe me, it was never revolutionary as we would understand it. We can do this in another time. On the question of not feeling oppressed, that's very common among younger women. It's still the case. It's a reason that the women's liberation movement was by and large not started in the student movement, but by slightly older women who first came up against the barriers that they hadn't seen until then. So I think that's important when we think about who we're addressing, that student women have to already be Marxist and have a generally highly developed worldview before they see it as close to them. And on this question of what Marxism has to offer, I don't think it can be answered in the abstract. It's one of the reasons I don't see it myself as a Marxist. I think some of the questions that have been raised that are very real in people's lives are the first thing to do, and you don't have to be a reformist to want to engage in those. If people want the dirt on the Spartacus League, we can have a separate which I will explain that two of the founders of the IBT voted to expel two of the others, just as I did with them and my husband, and I don't think I'll ever forget that. That's when I understood what Stalinism was, in a way.
Can I render? Sorry.
I won't get into any further on that. We can have a very entertaining session. I invite the Platypus to sponsor us, and we can have popcorn too.
Maybe can I render Laura's question just a little bit more concrete? Like, what are the political demands the Socialist Party in the 21st century would have to take up now, acknowledging the changes of the 20th century? Like, what are the most pressing concerns of socialists in the 21st century now? What do we demand?
Can I jump on that? And just put a
there's
point? No, it's appropriate actually. Because the question is actually, what does Me Too offer, like, for women today, and how could Marxism take up Me Too? Because Me Too is a social discontent in the present, in the 21st century. And like you were saying, these ideas, what was appropriate, have been there for 20 or 30 years, maybe 40 years. But how is it, like, what does it mean that it's happening now? And how could that be taken up in a revolutionary way?
Also, Lucy gets to ask.
No, yeah, it's okay. Mine is also related, but we can come back. Yeah.
Cool.
I don't have an answer. I think that's a really critical question. I think ignoring Me Too or saying, as I feel like saying, come on, it's a distraction, isn't going to get you somewhere. How do we move that forward and use it to illustrate where does it all come from? Some of which, even when you were talking about the casting couch and how long it's been going on, has to do with unequal relations. And it's something that economics, when you teach you, does very badly, which is to talk about power relations. And that's what I think Marxists could elaborate more. I mentioned as well, when you internalize that you are inferior, that's very important. That's part of what women's liberation did that was different, was that people actually began to see how they behaved according to the stereotypes. Then you also have to see who actually has the power. What's the power? That you starve or don't starve. You get a job or don't get a job, and how we behave. And explaining that about people's lives, it was very powerful in women's liberation. I still remember it, and I'm not ashamed of going around with what were trivial, real-world examples because you saw how you were affected by society, and that itself is part of the education. I don't like to use the word Marxist in the same way, but I know when I act, I'm not a free agent completely. I have a degree of agency, but I have a degree in which I'm formed by everything around me. And I think educating people that way is extremely important, and it's not easy. But I like the idea of what do we do with Me Too? Where is it going?
I would agree with a lot of that, actually, in the sense that, although I'm not a fan of the whole Me Too thing, I think what we can take from it is where it's a question of power relations and where it's not. And that is about agency, and that's about are you in a position where this is going to determine your future? Are you in a position where you can fight back? Can you collectivise to fight back? And I don't think this is just for the sort of Me Too, but in different forms of repression. Can you you are much stronger as a group to therefore take on, if you are in a weaker situation in terms of power relations, you become stronger by fighting together. I think what's also important from that is that we don't create a victim culture where you're not allowed to say or do anything, and women need to be protected and wrapped up and be free from all sort of negative comments. The women are educated and have, empowered into producing intelligent responses to these things from a position of strength. So I think that that's something that the left can offer. What I think the left has come, in some ways has come a long way from just sort of treating women as funny-shaped workers and really taking on the notion of the women question historically. So I think that's something that is fundamental to that question. Very quickly on spatial awareness, I was listening to the Infinite Monkey Cage last week on Radio 4, and apparently the developments in the brain depend on what your sort of stimulus is. So spatial awareness changes not just in women and men, but if you grow up in a sort of very desert landscape, how you define different points, or if you have a smartphone and you have maps on it, how you define different points. So I don't think that's necessarily a gender question. I think that's more to do with conditioning, but I'm not a neuroscientist.
Yeah, and I didn't know that the gap was closing. That's interesting, but I've heard more arguments that the spatial awareness thing is to do with conditioning more than we ever thought, which is not surprising. If you give a 1-month-old baby boy a football, and you give a 1-month-old baby girl a doll, whatever, it starts from so young, and we can't separate the nature-nurture debate until we change the conditions. But I just want to draw in the Marxist feminist thing as well as part of all of this. Reading more about Marxist feminism, what does it offer us? I feel like it's offered me quite a lot of confusion apart from anything else. It's not that Marxist feminists haven't been some of the best campaigners for women's rights, but theoretically I don't think they give us anything different. The wages for housework is something that has come from so-called Marxist feminists, and it's complete nonsense. It's trying to reconcile the irreconcilable. It's trying to take that Marxist tinge, and square it with feminism. And it's also anti-working class, and I think that a lot of Marxist feminism ends up being that, because it's actually anti-trade union. So what do we do with, what are the concrete concerns for women today, someone asked. Sarah brought up the casual part-time work in very low-paid industries. These are particular issues for working women. That's where we need to concentrate our efforts to a certain extent, unionising, educating women, drawing women in from their isolation. These are the concerns. There are many ways that we can socialise domestic chores within a capitalist framework and push for that, and free childcare is a major one. So these are some of the pressing concerns. Now, on Me Too, I found that one of the really interesting stories coming out of it was Salma Hayek. Don't know if anyone's read about Salma Hayek's story, because her abuse by Harvey Weinstein was... it is kind of like a sad story. Salma Hayek, but why I like her story is that it wasn't just about sex. It was she had her project of Frida, and she made the film Frida Kahlo, and it was her project, and Harvey Weinstein took it over and tried to, and it just became so, you could see really clearly how this was about wealth and it's about connections and power. Obviously he demeaned her as a woman, and he's also very racist, and everything you can imagine that Salma Hayek endured, and she did really internalise her oppression, and it was a very long journey for her, but she managed to essentially make that film partly on her own terms. I mean, she lost out in a big way. But what do we do with that? We need to penetrate this, anything that comes up, we can intercept it as Marxists, and that's what we need to do. But so one of our jobs is to bring in the big picture, because that's what feminists don't do. The Me Too campaign is just an isolated thing, and unfortunately it probably will be a passing thing that people won't necessarily remember in years to come. But there'll be different manifestations of it. So how do we try and offer a coherent worldview that offers a way out? Individuals posting on social media might raise awareness, for a few weeks, but it's not going to do more than that. We can raise awareness and consciousness in a much deeper way. Working women, I think you mentioned like being collectivized. I mean, the structure of the family, for example, it's so destructive. The way that we all run our lives, and we internalize it. We all normalize it too, without even realizing it. We deal with Me Too, but I don't think it's also, I don't think it's as big as people make out either, if I'm being really honest.
Richard.
So on the Me Too question, I just wonder if people had, first of all, specific responses to the letter that was published in Le Monde, the 100 women, if you've read it or had any reactions to that position, critical of Me Too. And the other question, people have spoken about power relations, but that's also a theme taken up by feminism, right? And it comes up with the question of consent, and whether you can have consent between where there's a difference of power relations. And it also goes to this sort of rhetoric of check your privilege, which is very common on the left. So I wondered if you'd talk to that issue about, like, obviously the goal of Marxism would be to abolish inequality, so generally, but within the context of actually existing inequality, we then have this question of consent, and whether in fact, say, consent is possible between people who have differing power relations, which is a common feminist criticism.
And perhaps in
I'm conscious about the time, though. Are we? Because I would like
to keep going if it's.
Okay. So I wanted to repose the question that I asked yesterday, actually, at the 68 panel, and Roxy brought it, and it's actually related to this: how, what is Marxism relevant today, and where are we at? How did we get to Me Too? I guess. So it's kind of pushing, like trying to understand again the history between 68 and now. But I was asking about, and Roxy brought up how, there's concrete things about housing and healthcare and childcare that are all it disproportionately affect women. And I was asking yesterday about the welfare state and how in the 60s, in response to both the welfare state kind of arose from the presence of the Soviet, like in Britain, for example. I don't think it would have occurred without the presence of the Soviet Union. That's what kind of conditioned and produced it, the kind of post-war welfare state in Britain. And in the 60s, there was a kind of possibility to be critical of the welfare state and recognise that leftists were not necessarily for it. They recognised the kind of the way it might present an obstacle to people gaining consciousness of the need for revolution. And then somehow out of the 60s, I'm just wondering how the 60s produced this sort of and also helped to produce the kind of collapse of the welfare state, and what role leftists played in that. Marcuse like had this phrase that if you're critical of the welfare state in a period of its collapse in the 70s, that's almost equivalent to being a fascist, to kind of to criticize the welfare state. And today, I guess we've already witnessed its collapse, and the left has been kind of defending it against kind of neoliberalism. And then now with like Trump and Sanders, like both Trump and Sanders have offered like the potential of a kind of new New Deal, a kind of an attempt to kind of for the state to manage different like social, a different kind of model for health and social care. So I just wonder now, like, what would be the transitional demands to make of this present moment, and where are we at, and how have we got there? I guess in terms of and how that affects women. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got Me Too, power relations, and transitional demands in the welfare state. So anybody want to take a stab?
Transitional demands of the welfare state. I mean, we did touch on this yesterday to an extent. I'm not sure to what extent I'm prepared to talk about that specifically around the women question, but I think you can look at the question of democratisation within and getting rid of some of the bureaucracy within the welfare state. So as we talked about yesterday, the idea that the NHS is such a heavily bureaucratised machine, and it could work much more efficiently with more funding and less bureaucracy. And you probably see very similar things within education, within social security, and all these kind of things. I think the idea that if you got rid of all the paperwork involved in social security, you could actually just afford to give people houses for free. And get rid of housing benefits. I don't quite get the nature of the question.
I guess I was trying to, maybe I was also thinking of Hillary Clinton and like Clinton's role in the 90s, the Clintons themselves, the role in the 90s around like healthcare that I think Christopher Hitchens talks quite a lot about in his book on the Clintons, No One Left to Lie To. They're kind of dubious, the dubious character of their healthcare policy, and I guess them as Clintons as like as figures of neoliberalism that really seem to be kind of have the Me Too campaign. It seems to be defending and supporting, in a sense, in contradistinction to what Trump might be trying to do, or what Sanders might have been trying to do, that behind Me Too, that even as we might try to address it as Marxists, but behind Me Too is the desire for Hillary Clinton to be, or like someone else other than like in the Democratic Party to be the next president of the US. So how, if it has a leftist character, the desire of Me Too seems to be about getting rid of Trump and bringing back the Democrats, rather than addressing, so Oprah, the desire for Oprah to be the next president of the US. I guess I just wonder how.
Can I just, because I don't know if, okay. So, right, Me Too is propaganda by the political leadership of, the bourgeoisie, and it is in response to Trump, and it's the follow-up to Why Not Her? Why not her? Second part, Me Too, right? Because we're all fucked together, and because of Trump. And I think what the Marxists have to offer, well, they can offer an ideological critique. They can actually show what it is. It's like the political leadership of bourgeois women instrumentalizing women's sexual trauma for their interests. So I think that, they are irreconcilable. I don't think that Marxists should reconcile the irreconcilable and say, we can just be part of Me Too. I think that what it can do for women is say, look, these people are treating your sexuality as something to be protected, not enjoyed. They're tapping into your trauma to instrumentalize you to vote for this particular party. And the fact that people don't have a political understanding of this movement, I find to be the point that Marxists need to make. And so I sometimes, like, there's this sort of mushiness about how people respond to it because they want to just, like, be very careful that they're not offending anyone. But, you know, like, Marxists should put politics first, right? And so how do you do, I realize it's tricky. We don't really live in political times, so people feel like they have to empathize first. But yeah, so again, maybe the question that was offered, like, what do Marxists have to offer? You know, what is the critique of Me Too that Marxists can offer? What is it that you should do, not just to say, we're also here?
Yes, that. And what Lucy was saying, I think, was sort of drawing it together as well. I like the way you put it because, there's been a real lack of actual commentary in that direction, because I do think, it's hard to put your finger on it completely, but I think the more you look at it, it is this kind of shiny democratic veneer, the Clintons, Obama, figures to their left as well, but yeah, how do we bring that back? There was a real political agenda attached to Me Too that hasn't really been talked about, which is anti-Trump, and because he's such an easy enemy, so we take him and we say, oh look, this lesser evil must be better, and you know, it's really incredible, but within Britain too, you can see how short memories people have. It reminds me, though, of one of the criticisms of Laurie Penny when she tried to justify her vote to Clinton, which was that when we have a woman in power, we can at least be talking about these things, and you know, that's better than having Trump, because he wouldn't even be talking about it, or if he was, it would just be about how he's groping the women, whatever. But she was talking about it almost as if it's what we would call a bourgeois workers' party, as if it's a party that we can give some kind of support to, which we can associate with in some way as a worker, but that it has these programmatic issues, which, you know, I'd like to put her to the test of power almost, basically. And it's the complete epitome of lesser evilism, to not look at her political programme at all, but simply her as a woman. Even just the assumption that she would deal with women's issues when she gets into power is a complete non-starter. Like, it's obviously not. Also, I don't know if people are aware, but the Me Too campaign actually was, with that name, started, was it 2006? By, I've forgotten her name, a black woman from Harlem who was she was dealing particularly with violence against black women, and it was a grassroots campaign. This same hashtag was taken by and other rich white actors, and pushed with their own agenda. So I think that's worth mentioning as well. The welfare state and transitional demands, I think it's really important to make the distinction between them. I mean, I think you mentioned the crumbs, Sarah. And I mean, we know that the NHS, for example, which you mentioned, is just the crumbs of imperialism. That's why we had it, sort of still have it, and nothing more really. Transitional demands are what revolutionaries use to bring in that bigger picture, to push for a different framework. The NHS is designed to contain us within this framework, to give us some crumbs, and I'm not demeaning those crumbs, like without the NHS, which is what the American working class live with, we can see the devastation of that. But the welfare state is something very different from transitional demands, I think. I mean, we might win some reforms through fighting for the transitional demands, but the reformists who fight just as vigorously, to a certain extent, to maintain that welfare state are not doing it to head towards a different type of society. They are very much doing it to make this one better. And that's what distinguishes us from reformists, and it's what distinguishes us from feminists as well.
Well, if no one else is going to, I didn't think I would be defending Me Too. I put it on the table as something that was a distraction. Seeing it attacked, I feel very differently. And I also think that there's a certain amount of reasoning. I feel odd saying I don't think it's Marxist, so I'll say I don't think it's correct, which is that to see things as conspiracies. That is, we can see that things objectively unfold this way, and then we start to explain them as if the ruling class has a committee meeting in Washington, but nowadays it has to be not in the White House, and they decide what to do. The press does compete with itself. It does go a certain direction. People haven't been, I mean, I'm bored with Me Too, but I've been paying attention because it's my, I don't know, it beats following Trump, which I did. I did before he had 20% of the support. So, which is that, first of all, Weinstein was not a good target. It wasn't obviously, if there'd been a conspiracy to do something, you would have taken there are a lot of right-wingers out there also using casting couches and being disgusting. Al Franken had to be sacrificed. He's a perfectly reasonable presidential candidate of the Clinton sort of wing. It wasn't, things aren't designed like that. They work out to a certain way, but they're not designed that way. And we won't convince people if we talk like conspiracy theorists about it.
I was not saying it was a conspiracy.
Yes, you were.
No, people are mobilized.
You said, they're doing it, they're doing it, they're doing it. The bourgeoisie, listen to yourself for
It's
a
the
change.
initiative of the
Okay,
politicians.
I know you don't
It's not a
mean that. You're
conspiracy.
too smart to mean that.
If I may, just real
Socialists,
quick,
they don't
I
think
think
that way.
perhaps what we could think about is, Pam mentioned in her, at the beginning of the question of authoritarianism.
Yes.
And that this could be a popular movement that could be to the conservative end of, bolstering the Democratic Party, even if not straightforward.
I don't think it's going to do that because it's not going to get a lot of men. I haven't known, I mean, they go along with it, but right? And there haven't even been meetings on that.
For Trump.
Yeah. Somebody did ask about the 100 French women. That one was part of what is the distraction component, which is the celebrity culture. I'm sick of celebrity culture. It's a reason I don't want to see anybody think that Oprah would make a very good president, because that's not what we need. We need some professionals and not celebrities, and that's where we've got so far in the United States. Let's spare ourselves in Britain from it, right? The closest we have to it is Boris Johnson being funny, right? Politics should be for intelligent people making comments. So that's part of the problem, is that Me Too has been high celebrity titillation, basically, in part. But those women were they wanted some publicity. They were also correct that people flirted, because that's how you do it, but that's internalizing your oppression. If you decide to be an actress, you don't get anywhere. As far as I know, I'd like to see some actress memoirs that said, I resisted and I got the job anyway. Right? You can't be that brilliant an actress that you have to be the right person for the part. And on the other hand, why doesn't it happen to actors? Maybe it does, and we'll start to hear about it. I don't know. It does in any place where there's, for example, the ballet, where there's a high gay percentage. That we certainly are hearing enough about that. We're back to saying, that's what we should be saying, power relations, power relations.
Yeah.
Understand how they have a lot of power compared to even somebody hiring a maid, because somebody else can hire that maid. And I'm the only director of 20th Century Fox. But this is what happens in the world. That's how the world looks, stripping away that power relation.
Do you have a question?
Sure. Are we also wrapping up, or? Well, okay. I also am curious to hear the other panelists respond to what was just said. Really, I want
The power relations.
about power relations and about consent, about the letter by the French actors in Le Monde. But I'll just say my question too, but it's related. So, what do you make of the New Left claim, which was shared by feminists at the time, that the person was political? And so this is going back to the question of the rucksacks, the theme of the rucksacks. So the changing of fashion trends and social norms, which in some ways apply similarly to everybody, and in some ways affect women in a particular way, perhaps. And so to what extent are the changing or the breakdown of certain norms and expectations of personal relations, to what extent is that liberatory, or just tracing new forms of oppression? And so when Adorno confronted the student movement, he wasn't sure whether they were the left or would lead to a sort of new fascism. And so is Me Too the backlash? Or is Me Too, are we like preparing for a different backlash, or is Me Too the backlash? That's like the question.
I never understood the personal as political, so I can't tell you what exactly. Sometimes it was used to talk about individuals' behavior. And insofar as I saw it on the New Left, it was to me an unpleasant aspect. And the origin of that in Maoism, of criticism, self-criticism. Actually, Stalin started that, right? And self-criticism is part of, it's the most horrible thing you have to do when you don't believe it. And it runs, we all live in circles where you have that sometimes. But it ran like a red thread, as far as I know, through the whole Soviet period. People have told me about how they stupidly decided that they would defend Nicaragua when it wasn't the party line on the Moscow State University campus in 1978. And then what they said was we had to do a self-criticism. It was absolutely ghastly to translate it. That is the most horrible kind of demeaning thing that you see. I mean, it's not the most horrible. Somebody confessing to crimes before they have their head cut off on television is worse, but it has a similarity. And that was one of the problems with the personal as political, and the other is simply meant that how we behave toward each other is part of society, and that was positive. But not the struggle, individual struggle is not a very healthy way to change things, you know, by struggle sessions, where we tell people what's wrong with them.
Yeah, not those kind of personal things.
That's right.
Yeah,
exactly.
but the small and the big.
Yeah,
that's
right.
how
That's
I
right.
see it as well. That and which I mentioned in my speech. That so in that sense, the personal is political. It's just that when our, you know, for example, I demand the highest consciousness from my comrades, a higher consciousness than I demand from people who I might meet who haven't thought about things in such a deep way, for example. But we should all demand those things, you know, challenge sexism, for example, wherever it comes. But if we just focus on the personal, it then becomes depoliticised, and that's as simple as that, really, for me. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I would see it. The Catherine Deneuve thing, well, she was one among many who signed it. And I think basically the letter was, I agreed with most of it, and I think one of the main points they were making was the point that I raised about the lack of agency for women and that kind of thing. But I think that they, to a certain extent, in my opinion, did start to conflate flirtation, which somebody mentioned, with the difficulty of consent, sometimes a question of consent, that actually this wasn't really what it was about, actually. I don't really, and even though some people were trying to make it about that, and, you know, Catherine Deneuve talked about, you know, the right for men to hit on women and stuff like that. I mean, my emphasis would be a bit different, because it was always about men doing things to women again. I mean, she was still doing that even when she was talking about that. What about women? You know, what about women taking the initiative, for example? The point is, it's about power relations. And most sensible people can distinguish between these things. And if you are in a position of power and you're abusing that power, those kind of people that do that in a serial way, I think they're in a very clear category. Sometimes things get messy, but we need to listen to women, but we need to give everything due process as well. And I think that Me Too, it became a distraction, has become a distraction to a certain extent. And it misses out, as I said in my speech, the role of the state, the role of bosses. And again, that's what we bring as Marxists. I was going to talk about the case of Julian Assange, which would have been a bit controversial. Yeah? Okay. Seeing as he was in the news this week, I know that Laurie Penny's not a fan, it wouldn't surprise you. But, you know, for me, the point about Julian Assange is that whether he committed the alleged crimes or not was besides the point, and we wrote about this at the time when he was initially threatened with extradition, is that he was never going to get a fair trial because he was the founder of WikiLeaks. That's what it was always about. And he was being targeted because of that. And he was going to be put into prison for the rest of his life without a fair trial. And it doesn't take a Marxist to tell you that either. There are plenty of feminists that recognise that for what it was. But what a lot of the left and what feminists missed out from the equation was, and they had major illusions in the state, including different European states, like, oh, this one's nicer than Britain, or America's the evil one, but in Britain we're really fair. We can make sure that he doesn't get sent off. And Julian Assange knew better. That's why he stayed inside the Ecuadorian embassy for all these years. It's a typical example of where we can distinguish the analysis of a Marxist and a non-Marxist is the role of the state. What was the state's intention there, and how are they intending on carrying out? If you look at someone like Chelsea Manning and how she was treated, that's how people who challenged the state in that way are treated, and we shouldn't be under any illusions to that. So it wasn't about rape with Julian Assange, really.
Yeah, I would agree with most of what you said there, and just to add into the whole, I don't really entirely know where this is going, but the question of the personal and political as well. You judge people by the politics, but people, organisations politically also have a responsibility as well to membership, and I'm not a believer in codes of conduct or anything like that, but I do think that when certain things have happened in recent years in the British left, for example, if you look at SWP and things like that, they were handled incredibly badly. And you have to think as well about you can't just have a trial by mates, and there is there are processes by which to go about these things. So I think that's something you could look at if you were talking about personal and political, what's happened there. You could also, just to come on to, I do think that this Me Too thing is largely irrelevant, but what's not is looking at power relations and how that affects people in their careers and their lives. And that's something that existed before #MeToo and will continue to exist when there is not media furore around #MeToo. And I agree with generally.
It also existed before capitalism.
Yeah, yes it did, yeah. But I think as well, what's important when we look at that is thinking about this idea of power relations, and are you empowered to be able to say no? Are you empowered? Because it's a difference at what is consent. When can you consent to say yes, and when can you consent to say no? And there are situations where you might actually want to sleep with that person, and you can consent to you're an adult, so you might want to do that. That's okay. And it's not about, it's about women have the right to sexuality. It's not always a man that's in charge as well. So it could be that, there's a female boss. It doesn't matter. It could be a homosexual relationship. It doesn't matter. The point is, when do you have consent? That becomes very messy at times. And you can look at that, what is the age of consent? Is that arbitrary? Who decides that? Where are the power relations that cannot ever be consensual? So, as a teacher, I'm never going to sleep with one of my students, because for me that's wrong. As a power relationship, that would be wrong. But in universities it does happen quite regularly, I'm sure. But these people will get mark these people's essays and determine their grades. So it's a very messy question. I don't think there's a simple answer to it. But I think that within most adult spheres of life, there will be a time where you can give consent. The point is you're empowered to either say yes or no, and it's not going to affect your career.
If perhaps real quick I could maybe re-emphasize the question that came from Richard and also from Gabe that kind of got missed a bit, which is the power question. It kind of reminds me of, Judith, how you insisted at the beginning on calling it women's liberation, and so where does calling it women's liberation come from? Well, of course, the liberation movements, the national liberation movements of the 20th century. And so it seems as though this kind of idea of power dynamics and this focus on, the oppressed and the oppressor, which come from the national liberation movements of the 20th century and also perhaps from Stalinism and all of these things, are, to get to the personal and political point, being used to describe these personal sexual relationships. And I suppose, that's not something that you would have seen, for example, from Marxists kind of the 19th century, or even, when Lenin talks to Claire Zetkin, you don't see power come up. So I think the question of what is kind of the purpose of using power, how is it helpful for for us as Marxists or as feminists. And then you don't have to answer it right away. We can take another question. Efren?
Yeah, I'm conscious of the time, but I did just want to put a finer point on something Lucy raised, which is this issue of the welfare state. In the 60s, the New Left, in part, was against the welfare state, which it saw as the authoritarian police state, and eventually, later in the 70s and 80s, became its last defenders. But it's not simply a question of democratising the welfare state, because as Judith pointed out last night, democratising could mean the workers' collective making a restaurant close for lunch. And I'd just like to get the panellists' response to Adorno's perhaps provocation that the woman has more to fear from the social worker than from her abusive husband. You know, coming in his essay Sexual Taboos in the Law Today in the 1960s. To put a final point on that question about the welfare state.
Okay, we'll take one more. Why are you picking?
Okay, this is a question for all the panelists, and I guess it's sort of taking it back.
Could you speak a little louder?
Yeah, this is a question for all the panelists, and I guess it's taking it back to the New Left and to an extent 68. Because I think you've all alluded to the benefits of what is often labelled the sexual revolution. So, for example, the increase in freedom granted by access to abortion, the pill, loosening of restrictions on expected female conduct. But I'd like to ask, what it was, in your opinion, the net result of the sexual revolution progress for women, or does it have a more ambivalent character? For example, you could argue that that's what's being expressed in these two. Or did the sexual revolution never happen, or was there a kind of revanchist counter-revolution, counter-movement that pulled back on the gains that were made? That's my question.
Well, I've myself provocatively raised this idea that I've read that, you know, because everybody's liberated, women are hit on more because they're obviously available. I don't think that the empirical evidence shows that. We would have to go back in history on that. It's certainly not my view. There is more sexuality. I mean, that's apparently on the ebb, and that would be a good thing in some sense, that the hypersexuality of everyday life is a problem. Because we don't think so rationally, and I'm into rational thinking. No, I don't think. I think sexual liberation has been a plus for women overall, on balance. And there is a tiny minus to everything, right? I mean, I've raised it before. Women's liberation has a minus, which is that what's happened is that everybody wants partners in life. They don't want the pretty little girl. And so we have what's called assortative mating, which means that as long as we have a family, we have more inequality because of that. Because, you know, teachers marry teachers, doctors marry doctors, and workers marry, you know, manual workers marry manual workers. And that has caused a measurable increase in inequality between families. Does that mean I'm not in favor of women's? Life is contradictory, right? We don't have to stop there.
Me Too begins to raise the question of whether or not women's emancipation, women's sexual liberation is achieved at all. Has women's sexual liberation been achieved?
Well, I don't think anybody's has been. You know, we've got a long way to go in the world.
I guess
Is there a big difference? Yes. It was absolutely unthinkable, the kind of thing that's called slut shaming, right? I mean, you could call it that and you can feel embarrassed. It would have been deadly for people. I know what it was like growing up as a teenager in the Bronx. It was absolutely deadly. Other people would then stop associating with you, right? What you have now is some embarrassment. I'm not saying that's easy, but it is not the same. We do not get the same. It would have been suicide. So
it still is. There's teenage girls killing themselves over it.
No, mostly they're not, okay? Sometimes, yes, I don't want to say that any given case it happens is terrible. But no, basically that's not what happens. Because it's a different world that we live in. And I think it's positive. And what I think to compare it with would be to try to go find it. I bet there are corners of society, probably in Utah, where it's all very staid, and we could see what happens there. And by the way, it wasn't just a movement that happened, right? The reality is that there was also contraception and the pill, and then it was set back somewhat by HIV, of course. And when HIV was a death sentence and we didn't know that it was everywhere, right? So the forces of production do things too, basically, not just us.
Yeah, I think it points to a general truth, which is, okay, so overall, yes, there's definitely been a net gain. There's no doubt about that when we look at concretes like the pill and stuff like that. But it's to do, for me, it's to do with the cultural level and the economic basis of society. So when the struggle declines, then alternatives pop up, alternatives to working class politics. This happened in the 1970s, and into the late 1970s and beyond. But also, initially, especially when women's liberation was more radical, in the sense of revolutionary as well, that was all tied up with revolutionary change in society in general. And when that petered out, that's when the more reactionary areas of feminism began to grow. And so I think what you're partly getting at is that Me Too is, well, for me, it's not just about, yes, it's partly about ebbing and flowing. There's been a net gain. What does that really mean? Me Too is a reflection of our poor cultural level and our and the state we're in to a certain extent as well. That this is what we're talking about. It's, and you know, we mentioned Trump as well, like how someone like him can get into the White House. It's, if you need to look at the big picture and the social basis as to why these things ebb and flow, and I don't think it's necessarily in a positive direction in that sense. I'm not sure I understood your question, Ephraim. Were you asking about, so social workers? I'm not familiar with Adorno's essay. Social workers versus the abusive husband. Is this about the intervention of the state?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm still not really sure what the question is. Well, what's the? Could you?
I was just trying to put a finer point on Lucy's question about what the relationship of the New Left and the women's struggles was to the welfare state, because now it seems to demand things from the welfare state, protections, etc. Whereas previously it recognised it as a limitation on women's freedom.
Right. Well, I mean, things had different manifestations in different times, but essentially at the moment, the way the vast majority of the left, I think, a lot of the left relates to the welfare state is in a very reformist way, and this is partly related to the Labour Party and the left's relationship to the Labour Party at the moment, which, whilst Corbyn in himself was a sign that things were starting to wake up a little bit again, in general, it's also a sign of our the paucity of our cultural level and our consciousness, that this is what we think is progress as well. So, yeah, I don't have a kind of really concise answer to compare the New Left to now, but I think in terms of how we relate to the welfare state, I think the Labour Party and reformism is a big part of that.
I think in being a provider, you can also be an oppressor, right? So the welfare state's always acted like a kind of daddy,
Right,
and then
yeah.
it's not actually really changed, almost, in the sense that, yeah, it was restrictive of freedom, and now it offers a kind of pseudo-possibility, and that is a similar sense of provision.
Yeah, but there are real things that we would fight for, but in terms of how much emphasis we put on it and the types of reforms that we demand, and also recognising that these things can be snatched away at any moment as well. And you know, and I mentioned Corbyn and how, you know, he's really not that left wing, but that he became this figure that everyone looked to was a sign of how backwards everything had become. There's no alternative. There's no revolutionary alternative.
Anybody else wants to say something?
Are we finished? Are we winding up?
Yeah, maybe let's wind up. Let's wrap up. Maybe, because I know a couple people wanted to ask questions, we'll take them, but then just make closing remarks, and then if you would like to comment on the questions too. So
We're half an hour over.
Oh, we're already over? Maybe let's just wrap up.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we might need to
Do you guys want to make final comments? I mean, if you want to say, if there's something that you still feel like you can tell us.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah.